The storm hit without warning. Lieutenant Mara Voss had seen atmospheric disturbances before. Hurricanes on Earth, ion storms near Jupiter's moons, even the crimson dust devils of Mars. But nothing compared to the fury that descended upon the Kethran refugee camp that night. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing through the temporary shelters with claws of ice and rage. She'd been assigned to the camp for 3 months now, part of the Human Diplomatic Corps' humanitarian mission to the war-torn Kethran system. The Kethrans were a feline species, their civilization shattered by a decade-long conflict with the neighboring Vrex Dominion. What remained were scattered populations of survivors, mostly females, elderly, and cubs. The cubs. Mara's heart clenched as another gust rocked the medical tent where she'd been cataloging supplies. Somewhere in the darkness, dozens of Kethran young huddled in their communal shelter, probably terrified. Their caretakers had gone to the southern perimeter hours ago to help reinforce the failing barriers. The tent's support beam groaned ominously. "Protocol says evacuate," Mara muttered to herself, grabbing her emergency kit. But evacuate where? The storm had transformed the camp into a maze of flying debris and collapsing structures. Her communicator crackled with fragments of panicked voices before dying completely. She made it perhaps 20 meters before a sheet of corrugated metal spun through the air like a blade. Mara dove, felt the edge graze her shoulder, and scrambled behind an overturned supply container. Pain lanced through her arm, not serious but enough to slow her down. The wind intensified, carrying with it rain that felt like frozen needles. Mara's uniform, designed for moderate climates, offered little protection. Already she could feel the hypothermia creeping in, that dangerous lethargy that whispered it would be easier to just rest for a moment. She pressed her back against the container, trying to orient herself. The command center was northwest, she thought. Everything looked different in the chaos. Her teeth began to chatter. That's when she saw them. Through the sheets of rain and darkness, small shapes moved with purpose. At first, Mara thought she was hallucinating. But no, they were real. Kethran cubs, at least a dozen of them, emerging from their shelter despite the storm's fury. The smallest one led the pack, Rinkar. Mara recognized him immediately. He'd been coming to the medical tent for weeks, bringing her strange gifts: smooth stones, interesting leaves. Once a remarkably ugly insect he seemed convinced was beautiful. He was barely 2 feet tall, his gray-striped fur perpetually tousled, his yellow eyes too large for his small face. Those eyes locked onto her now with startling intensity. "Rinkar, go back," Mara shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. The cub kept coming, dragging something behind him. A blanket, one of the thermal blankets from their shelter. The other cubs followed, each pulling blankets of their own, moving in a coordinated group that spoke of rapid decision-making. They surrounded Mara's position, and Rinkar, that impossibly small, impossibly brave cub, climbed directly onto her lap and began wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "No, no," Mara protested, trying to push him away. "You need these. Go back to your shelter." But Rinkar's tiny claws gripped her uniform with surprising strength. He chittered something in Kethran, his high-pitched voice barely audible. The other cubs pressed closer, adding their blankets to hers, creating layers of warmth. They formed a living barrier around her, their small bodies pressed together, using their combined mass to shield her from the worst of the wind. Mara felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "You foolish, brave little ones," she whispered. In Kethran culture, as she'd learned during her training, cubs were precious beyond measure. After years of war, each young life represented hope for species survival. They were protected above all else, sheltered, valued more than any adult. The idea that they would leave safety to help her, a human, an alien, essentially a stranger despite her months among them, defied everything she understood about their society. Yet here they were, shivering in the storm, wrapping her in warmth they desperately needed themselves. Rinkar pressed his small face against her chest, his purring vibration barely perceptible but deeply comforting. Around them, the other cubs maintained their vigil, their ears flattened against their heads, tails wrapped around each other for stability. The storm raged for another hour. Mara used that time to gather the cubs as close as possible, sharing what body heat she could, telling them stories in broken Kethran about Earth, about cats, which made them chirp with confusion and amusement. about snow and oceans and cities that touched the sky. When the winds finally began to subside, adult Kethrins appeared, their calls frantic as they searched for their missing young. Elder Shirma, the camp's matriarch, found them first. She stopped dead at the sight, her aged eyes widening. Mara prepared for anger, for recrimination. She'd somehow allowed their most precious ones to risk themselves. Instead, Shirma lowered herself to the ground, pressing her forehead to the mud in a gesture Mara had never seen. When she looked up, her eyes gleamed with something that transcended species: recognition, respect, understanding. They chose, Shirma said in careful standard. Cubs know. Always know. You are packed now. In the days that followed, Mara learned what had happened. The cubs had watched her for months, observing her gentleness with the injured, her patience with the elderly, her willingness to work longer hours than any other human volunteer. When the storm hit and the adults were away, Rinkar had insisted, with the absolute certainty only a child possesses, that the sad-eyed human who always shares her food needed help. So they'd voted, in the way Kethrin cubs apparently voted, with tail flicks and ear positions, and unanimously decided that blankets and warmth were more important than safety. That Mara Voss was worth saving. The story spread beyond the camp, beyond the planet. Humans heard it and felt their chests swell with belonging. Kethrins heard it and looked at their human allies with new eyes. The Vrex Dominion, monitoring communications, heard it and began questioning their own certainties about the weakness of species who valued mercy. But for Mara, the meaning was simpler and more profound. On a night when storms tore through the camp, cubs had dragged blankets to protect the human. And in doing so, they'd revealed a truth that transcended war, species, or survival instinct. Courage isn't measured in size, and family isn't limited by biology. Rinkar still visited her tent daily, though now he brought other gifts, usually other cubs, who'd heard the story and wanted to meet the human-worth blankets. Mara welcomed them all, sharing her rations and stories, building bonds that would outlast any storm, because she understood now what the cubs had known all along. In the darkest moments, we're defined not by what divides us, but by who we choose to shelter from the cold.